So we learned earlier today that in international business, international trade, there are rule makers and rule takers. So as I was reading the instructions for the conference, I decided to be a rule taker, and I decided to make my presentation for 15 minutes. So it's probably going to be a little bit short, which gives us more time for discussion. Secondly, as I teach in the doctoral program here also, one piece of advice I give to my students who are going to make a presentation at an academic conference is minimize the text. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and tell a story. So one thing I'm going to try to do this afternoon is to tell a story. Tell a story about the port of Trieste. I'm not an expert on China or the Belt and Road Initiative. I came into this a little bit by accident, which I'll explain to you in just a few moments. But to start with, who here knows where Trieste is? Raise your hand, please. Oh, wow, okay. How many of you looked to see where Trieste is after you saw the presentation title? No, that's good, okay. So about half the audience knows where it is, which is more than most people. Here at Rollins, we have a partnership with a business school at the University of Trieste. And every year we send a group of students there to do a consulting project for a local company. And last year I led a group of 6 students. We worked with MBA students from Trieste, and we actually did a project on the port of Trieste because they're looking to expand, and one of the things they were looking at is potential partners. And what came up in that discussion was that they were already talking with some agencies in China about investing in the port of Trieste. This year in March, I went back to Italy with a different group of students to work on a different project. And just before we went to Italy, guess what happened? An agreement was signed. President Xi was in Italy with a number of Chinese business people, including the chairman of the Chinese Chinese Communication Construction Corporation. And they signed a memorandum of understanding with the president of the ports of Eastern Adriatic, including Trieste. And those 2 gentlemen are in the center there. And on the right side is the Prime Minister of Italy, Giuseppe Conte. This was a surprise to many people. Because they'd kept this fairly quiet, and of course President Xi is there, you can see him there on the left, applauding the agreement. And this memorandum of understanding contained 29 separate agreements, primarily dealing with Chinese investment in Italy and opening up some Chinese markets to Italian goods. Now, like some of the other, so the question I have here is, why Trieste? What's so special about Trieste? And I'll come to that in just a moment. But like several of our previous presentations today, I'm going to cover a fairly wide area. A little bit is history, a little bit is geography, a little bit is politics, and some is economics as well. I don't need to talk too much about the Belt and Road Initiative itself. I think most of you understand what it is and why it's important. But from a maritime perspective, as the previous speaker said, the road link isn't that so important, at least for taking business to doing business with Europe. The reason is because it's slow and it's bureaucratic, because the road link or the rail link goes across many countries, and each one has got separate needs for paperwork and documentation, and that slows everything down. Whereas the shipping routes through the Suez Canal and into Europe are much easier. You load the goods on the ship in China, you sail them around to Europe, you unload them. It doesn't matter which port in Europe you unload them in, as long as it's in the European Union, because the paperwork is the same. Of course, with the exception of this place up here, which might no longer be in the European Union. And speaking as a Brit, I am very sorry about that. But so from a maritime perspective, the ports in Europe are very important to China. And that helps explain why Chinese companies have been investing a lot in the ports of Europe over the last several years. All the way from the port of Piraeus in Greece, just outside Athens, to the ports of Rotterdam and further up at Bremen and ports in the North Sea. One thing you don't see on this map, and that is the port of Trieste. So, why Trieste? As I said, I'm going to look at these particular things, but let's start with the geographic part. It's up in the northeast corner of Italy, kind of tucked away there. And the New York Times earlier this year referred to Trieste as a forgotten Italian port. And to most Europeans, that's exactly what it is. If you ask them to name, the top 10 ports in Europe, they won't mention Trieste or any of the Adriatic ports in the neighboring countries. But if we look at history, we'll see that the port of Trieste has a long, long history. This is a map of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which dominated Europe until the end of the First World War in 1918, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was one major port, and that was Trieste. Trieste was associated with the first Hungarian Empire and then the Austro-Hungarian Empire for hundreds of years, from the 1300s right up until the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918. And an important thing, think about when this agreement was signed. It was signed in March this year, March of 2019. In 1719, 300 years previously, the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire gave Trieste the designation of a free port. That's really important because a free port means that goods can come in, goods can go can be stored there, they can be unpacked, repacked without having to pay taxes. And this designation as a free port is something that Trieste keeps today, 300 years later. Another part of its history, at the end, after 1918, this part of Eastern Italy, it was now Eastern Italy, which formerly was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was given to Italy. At the end of the Second World War, 1945, you had Italy here, and over here you had the former country of Yugoslavia, which was a communist country. It was led by General Tito. In 1945, the Yugoslav army occupied the area where Trieste is right now, including the port of Trieste. And they said, this belongs to us. We are the descendants of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This port belongs to us. We need it. And it wasn't until the Allied forces moved in and kind of told the Yugoslav army to back out. That happened in 1945, and they agreed to partition the area. Well, without going into too much of the history, to cut the story short, the northern part here, including the port of Trieste, became, again, part of Italy. The southern part down here was handed over to Slovenia or to Croatia, which were parts of Yugoslavia and eventually became separate independent states. Now, why is that important? It's important because, keep in mind, Trieste was given the free port status 300 years ago. And this status was guaranteed after the Second World War by the USSR and Yugoslavia. Well, the USSR is no longer there. Yugoslavia is no longer there. So the free port status of Trieste cannot be changed. Nobody has the authority to change it. The government of Italy can't change it, and the European Union can't change it. So it has a permanent free port status, unlike any other free port in Europe. So let's move on then. So why Trieste? Well, traditionally it had very good connections with Central and Eastern Europe, and those connections are still there today. So it has road and rail connections to Austria, Hungary, further through Slovakia and Poland, and eventually, as we'll see, to the Baltic states, to former Yugoslavia, Croatia, Serbia. And these communication systems are very, very good. also to parts of southern Germany as well. In Europe, there's a trans-European transport network, and once again, we see here Trieste is down here with some of its neighbouring ports, and the Baltic-Adriatic corridor goes all the way up through Eastern Europe, all the way up to the Baltic up here. So again, very, very good transportation links. So, coming back to this agreement then, this Memorandum of Understanding, 29 agreements, some worth somewhere between 2.5 billion euros and 20 billion euros. Nobody is exactly sure how much it's going to be. Is it good for Italy? On the whole, people would say, yes, it is good for Italy. For one thing, there's promises of investment in the port of Trieste. And those investments are going to be useful in expanding the port and increasing the amount of trade going through. Developing the intermodal rail and road connections. That already has that intermodal network in the port, but it needs to be upgraded. Another thing that it has, that it offers, is access to Chinese markets. Italy is desperate to get more of its exports sold in China. Chinese food, especially, is very popular in. Italian food is very popular in China. So making it cheaper and easier for especially small and medium-sized Italian companies to get their goods to China is going to be important for the Italian economy. Also, right now, the current government, the current five-star movement government in Italy, is very supportive of this agreement. At the time the agreement was signed, China had a coalition government between the five-star movement and the Northern League. The Northern League were much more nationalistic and didn't really approve of this agreement. But the Northern League are now no longer part of the Italian government. So that kind of smooths the way for this agreement to go through. On the negative side, there's still a lot of questions about, well, just how far will this agreement go? How much investment is there going to be in Italy, and especially in the port of Trieste, by Chinese companies? And there's another underlying thing as well, which is similar to what we've seen in Africa and in South Asia, that if there is an offer of Chinese investment which is linked to loans, will the port of Trieste and perhaps the Italian government be able to repay these loans? And if they can't repay the loans, will that lead to a Chinese takeover of the port of Trieste? This is what happened also in Greece, where the port of Piraeus is now operated on a 99-year lease by a Chinese company. From the Chinese perspective, this is certainly a good idea. If I can just go back very quickly, I should have put that other map in here. Yeah, here we go. Right now, ships coming from China either stop in Piraeus. The problem with Piraeus is that the road and rail links into Central and Eastern Europe are not very good, especially in Bulgaria. The railroad system in Bulgaria needs radical overhaul. So the infrastructure in the Baltics is not really conducive to Piraeus becoming a major port. The alternative right now is, well, Genoa again doesn't have the good connections to Eastern Europe. So the alternatives are going all the way over to the northwest Europe, to the major ports like Rotterdam, Bremen, and so forth. But that's another at least 7 days journey for most ships to go around. Whereas the port of Trieste offers 3 days from Suez and really cuts down the travel time and the expense. So, as far as China is concerned, faster routes to the markets in Central and Eastern Europe, and this is going to help the Made in China 2025 project, which we heard about earlier today. The idea of China developing more value-added products, especially in the high-tech area, and moving up the value chain. And this, in turn, will help China achieve the high-income status by 2027, which is one of the goals of the government. Another advantage of Trieste, especially more so than any other ports in the area, is its deep water harbour. up to 18 meters. That means it can bring in the biggest container ships available in the world right now, the post-Panama style ships, which many ports in Europe cannot handle. Greater expansion of Chinese foothold on European ports, so another port there to add to the ones that are already there. Another partner, another EU partner for the Belt and Road Initiative. Not only another EU partner, but a member of the G7. And this was really a diplomatic coup for President Xi and his entourage when they were in Italy, because Italy is the first member of the G7 to sign on to the Belt and Road Initiative. And there's some consternation not only in Europe but also in the United States that this could lead to a breakup of the E7, with Italy going a separate way, rather than what the EU would like, which is to maintain a solid European front towards the Belt and Road Initiative. And as I said earlier, the big advantage of Trieste is its permanent free port status. Nobody can take that away from them. So, with 5 minutes to go, that's the end of my presentation. I hope it was useful to you, and I look forward to questions later. Thank you very much.